Very welcome to all of you. Those of you here in the hall, lovely to see you. And all of those joining us on Zoom. We've had Valerie speak to us on several occasions, all the way from England. And because they're now into their Greenwich Mean Time again, she's had to get up very early because it's only just going 8 o'clock there. But Valerie, thank you very much. This is a different subject from you normally talk to us about, so I'm really, really fascinated to hear your insights into this fascinating woman. Thank you for joining us today. We'll have Caroline introduce you.
Good morning, Valerie. Good morning to everybody. I think the people that we've got attending today, whether in person or over Zoom, are doing so because of how much they have enjoyed your 2 previous art history lectures. But we know from our notices that you also have a particular interest in Tudor history. And I think with a title like Harlot or Heroine, people are really very stimulated to know what it is that you'll tell us today. And I believe that some of us have also become more and more interested in Gresham College, the wonderful institute in London for which you have done so much work in the past and which you continue doing work for. So we very much look forward to listening to you this morning. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you for inviting me again, everybody. And I'm really glad to talk to you again. And this is a slightly different subject rather than art history. It's history because, as Caroline said, I'm particularly interested in the Tudors, and I was actually asked to do a bit about the Tudors, which I'll talk about at the end. Let's start with a bit of audience participation. Anne Boleyn, Harlot or Heroine? Could we perhaps, for those in the hall, I can't see you, but I know you can see each other. Can we have a show of hands? Who thinks that she was a scheming, ambitious, immoral temptress? Or who thinks she was a victim and the highly educated mother of England's greatest ruler? So who votes for Harlot? And who votes for Heroine? And I don't know, I can't see you, so I don't know what the outcome of that was. But when I did this talk previously a little while ago, most people just shouted out a bit of both. So let's see.
Valerie, nobody put up a hand for Harlot, but there were 2. And then there were lots for Heroine. So there we go.
All right. Well, that's good. That's good to know. Okay. So who was she? The scheming, ambitious, immoral temptress, or a highly educated mother of England's greatest, possibly England's greatest ruler? And her life, appearance and character I'll talk about. And of course, Anne and her relationship with Henry VIII and the romance and her divorce and the annulment and so on. And her fate. And I think we need a spoiler alert here, although I think that actually everybody knows what happened to her. A subtitle for this could be 6 weddings and 2 funerals, or actually since 3 of the marriages were annulled, he only had 3 wives, not 6. But of course, she's really famous. I mean, who can name another queen consort? Maybe Eleanor of Aquitaine, but everybody knows about Anne Boleyn worldwide. Just about everybody has heard of her. And we sort of tend to talk to her about her as if we knew her, which is a bit strange. So her fate, of course, was to be executed on the 19th of May, 1536. So this is a story of sex, death and money, the sort of the fundamentals of any good story, I suppose, except this is basically true, except there's some information missing. We can look at the Tudor dynasty and the need for a male heir. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And the way that Henry VIII, who was born in 1491, became king aged 17 in 1509. His older brother had died, his father had died, his mother had died, his grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, had also died. So he was pretty much left by himself at age 17 to try and sort everything out. But there are a lot of what ifs here. What if Prince Arthur, his older brother, had lived. He died when he was 15. What if Catherine of Aragon, much older than Henry, and did not have a healthy son? What if she had had a healthy son? They did have one son together, Prince Henry, who died just after a couple of months. What if he'd lived? What if she'd gone quietly to a nunnery when she was asked? What if Anne had got married? She had lots of suitors. She could easily have married somebody else. Or if Anne had had a son, or if Elizabeth had been a boy. So there are lots of things going on here, and there are lots of unanswered questions. For example, her precise date of birth, whether she was really in love with Henry or whether it was a lust for power. And did she really keep the king waiting for 6 or 7 years? And then remember that she was very forward thinking. She had a passion for reform and the new learning, or perhaps she was interested in just having a good time and enjoying court life and all the riches. Probably a bit of both, I think, a bit of everything. So she was born probably at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, which was the property owned by the family since the early 15th century. This is what it looks like now. It was restored in the 17th century, so it didn't look like that at the time, but she was actually born then. But we don't really know where she was born or when she was born or her birthday or anything like that. The family later obtained Hever Castle in Kent, and that still stands. It's open to visitors, and I've been there recently. And she spent a lot of her childhood there. So she might have been born at Hever or at Blickling, but probably born at Blickling and then moved on to Hever. Now her father, Thomas Boleyn, illustrated here, this is him. It's labelled Ormond, so he was the Earl of Ormond, but it might be another Earl, we're not sure. But this is usually taken as to be an image of Thomas Boleyn. And the family is often described, and in a recent television docudrama, as a sort of an upstart merchant family. But really, they were much more than that. They'd been property owners for a long time. And Thomas himself was a politician and diplomat. He was treasurer of the royal household, Lord Privy Seal, the Earl of Wiltshire, the Earl of Ormond, and Viscount Rochford. Now, some of these titles he obtained after Anne Boleyn became cosy with Henry VIII, but he did already have these titles. And Anne Boleyn's mother was Elizabeth Howard, who was daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. And of course, the Dukes of Norfolk would not have married their daughter into a family that were upstart merchants and impoverished. The Boleyns were of noble extract. So I think it's quite interesting to look here at her parentage and her lineage just quickly. And you can see from this table that, as Eric Ives said in The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn, he's what I would regard as the authority on Anne Boleyn, that she was actually born a great lady rather than simply a family of London merchants. They'd been landowners in Norfolk since the 13th century and rich enough to give land. Her great-great-grandparents gave land to their son. And they had a rapidly rising status with lots of Norfolk manors. They married lots of heiresses. Her great-grandfather married an heiress. Her great-grandparents, it was Geoffrey Boleyn in the 15th century. He was a member of a London livery company, a master mercer, an alderman. He was a hatter, and it's said that he was in trade. But of course, to join a livery company, quite often, like actually Sir Thomas Gresham, quite often you joined you did an apprenticeship of the livery company as well. He made a very good marriage to the daughter of a baron, and was Keeper of the Seals and Chancellor of France. And he was the one who bought Blickling in 1452 and Hever in 1462. Her grandparents, again, were well-heeled. He was a wealthy and powerful High Sheriff of Kent, Norfolk and Suffolk. He was the Deputy Lord High Admiral, and he married the daughter of the Earl of Ormond. And then Anne's own parents, I've mentioned already. Her father wasn't very well off. He had a small allowance, £50 a year, which was not inconsiderable in those days. But once his father died, he had a massive inheritance, and he became an ambassador, and later on had all these other titles. So through her mother, through her maternal lines, through her parents, her family actually included a duke, an earl, a granddaughter of an earl, and daughters of barons and so on. And she was better born and educated than some of Henry's other wives, like Jane Seymour. So if we're looking at upstarts, let's have a look at Henry VIII's lineage. And this is actually a bit shaky in comparison. The Tudors, if you look at the comparison here with the Boleyns in this grey area and the Tudors in the red area, the Tudors in Wales were descended from a prominent family, but they fought against Edward I, so they could almost be regarded as traitors. Owen's father, Owen Tudor, his father was possibly a bastard son of an alehouse keeper or a fugitive murderer, so that's a bit kind of shaky. And Owen Tudor, Henry VIII's grandfather, was actually described as a servant or a groom by a chronicler. And his claim to fame was that he married Catherine of Valois. Now, Catherine of Valois was the widow of Henry V. Henry V died fairly young age after winning Agincourt and so on. And Owen Tudor married his widow. So, in fact, their offspring together had no Lancastrian blood or Royal English blood at all. Henry VIII's grandparents, his Edmund Tudor, married Elizabeth Beaufort. And again, Elizabeth Beaufort, she had some Lancastrian blood, but it was an illegitimate line from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. The children were legitimised later on when John of Gaunt actually married Catherine Swynford, but originally this was on the condition that they never made a claim to the throne of England. So Henry VII, who descended from these lines of the Tudors and the Beauforts, didn't really have a very particularly good claim, and he was overseas until he came back to England, fought against Richard III and won the claim by invasion. This was rather like William the Conqueror, in my view, that he had a shaky claim and actually won the position by an invasion. So it's important to remember this background so that you can realise how obsessed Henry VIII was with having a legitimate male heir. Wait a minute, I think there's one being missed out there. No. So going back to Anne Boleyn, let's look at her early life, and this is, presented in the form of a CV. She went off in 1513-14 to the Netherlands as she was maid of honour to Margaret of Austria, who was she was a Habsburg related to Charles V and his father. And she ran a sort of finishing school for aristocratic young ladies in the Netherlands. And Anne Boleyn was described as very bright and pleasant for her young age. After a couple of years there, Anne Boleyn went on to France at the court of Queen Claude, who is pictured on the top right. This is Queen Claude, not Anne Boleyn. And there she learned sophisticated, stylish ideas from the French court. She became fluent in French. She also became interested in humanist thought and the new learning, the classics, which also she would have been exposed to while in the Netherlands. But she also picked up the French ideas of chivalry, courtly love, fashion, etiquette, music, singing and dancing, and French culture and education. So these were her her qualifications and skills when she came back to England in 1522. And she had some offers of marriage, one to James Butler here, who was the Earl of Ormond, to sort of reinforce the family's connections there. And also Henry Percy, this chap here, who was the Duke of Northumberland, one of the most senior dukedoms in England. She didn't get married. She became a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, with lots of festivities and dancing and really having a good time. She was also interested, caught the eye of Thomas Wyatt, the poet, who was actually married at the time. Now, her date of birth, as I said, there are some mysteries attached to her. She used to be accepted as having been born in 1507. Remember, she was executed in 1536. We know that date for sure, of course. And it was accepted that she had been born in 1507 because she was described as being very young when she went overseas and not 29 when she was executed. But another date has been proposed that she probably couldn't have been as young as perhaps 7 or 8 when she went to the Netherlands. But also there's this letter on the right here, which is dated 1514, a letter from Anne Boleyn to her father, describing how she was learning French and so on. It's written in French, how she was getting on in the Netherlands. And it was suggested that she couldn't, if she'd been born in 1507, she couldn't have written this letter on the right when she was 7 years old, which seems reasonable. And the date of her birth, I think, is quite important because it depends whether she was a mature woman or a young girl when she met Henry in 1522, and whether she was around 29 or 35 when she was executed. But the letter, I think, is problematic because if we look at her handwriting here, these are genuine examples. Her letter to Fisher of 1529, you can see the handwriting is very different. And she was older, but quite often your handwriting is set from a very early age. And the example again on the right, which matches the one on the left, we know that's genuine because it has Henry's writing here. Henry had added a note. And also it's interesting that there's been an attempt to burn this letter. And we know that Henry did try to burn everything, destroy things, try and obliterate her from history after she was executed. Another letter to Henry from the Tower shows her handwriting in a much more cursive style. And also her Book of Hours. In this Book of Hours, which is on display at Hever Castle, you can see she's written a note here. I'll just zoom in on that. And again, the writing is much more fluid and cursive than in that letter. So it's difficult to know whether that letter was actually written by her and can be used to date her age, her date of birth, or whether in fact she might have had the help of a scribe, or it might have been copied later. So if we go back to the letter, here's the letter and here's her note. This was a note actually addressed to Henry VIII. Remember me when you do pray. They were sort of passing notes in missals and things to each other. And it's signed at the bottom here. It had been cut off later on, but very different from this writing that she was supposed to have written when she was 12 or 13. But recently I came across the writing of Thomas Boleyn and a letter to Wolsey that Thomas Boleyn wrote in 1519 about the preparations for the cloth of gold. And it struck me that Thomas Boleyn's writing is much closer to this 1514 letter than Anne's writing. So could Thomas perhaps have written it or copied it out? So we simply don't know. The letter is controversial, I think, if we see them all the versions together. So it's controversial, and my own guess would be that this letter is probably by a scribe or a later copy, or possibly even influenced by her father, and that she might have been born, my own guess would be, somewhere between 1501 and 1507, maybe around 1505, but I have no evidence for that. And of course, in all the things we're looking at, sort of the idea of the people who are writing about her, that they're confident that this or that is true. Confidence isn't the same as evidence, and we need to bear that in mind for the things we're going to look at this morning. So anyway, Anne Boleyn lived at Hever Castle, spent her childhood there. The portrait on the right is a near contemporary one, a 16th century one, whereas the image on the left is a Victorian imagination of what Anne Boleyn's life at Hever Castle would have been like. And there are very few contemporary images about her because, as I said, Henry tried to obliterate all knowledge of her. But there are a lot of later imaginings, artists' impressions, and I'll be using some of those. So looking again now at Henry VIII, as I mentioned, in 1509, he became king, aged at just 17. His parents and brother had died, and he had a very shaky claim after the Wars of the Roses. He married Catherine of Aragon in 1509 to reinforce the claim and to keep the Spanish dowry. She fell pregnant straight away, but miscarried. And then the year afterwards, they had a son who lived just 52 days, and many other miscarriages and so on. She was not the sort of meek and mild person that she's sometimes portrayed as. In fact, she more or less orchestrated the Battle of Flodden while Henry was away on the continent. And in 1516, she actually gave birth to a healthy child, which was Mary Tudor. Although remember, this is actually 7 years after the marriage, so it's quite a while. In the meantime, Henry VIII had mistresses. The one we know a lot about is Bessie Blount, and he had a son with Bessie Blount, who he acknowledged and called Henry Fitzroy. Fitz and Roy meaning son of the king, as I'm sure most of you realise. He also had an affair with Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister. And it seems to me that Mary Boleyn was the promiscuous one. She had quite a reputation at the French court. And it wasn't a question of, like quite often in, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice and Little Women, the oldest sister is the demure, lovely one. And the second sister is the one who is more lively. But I think that there's a case for saying that Anne Boleyn was actually the one who was less promiscuous, not Mary. So by 1525, Catherine, I forgot to mention, Mary Boleyn got married when Henry ditched her, and some people argue that her children were actually fathered by Henry, but there's no evidence of this. Catherine, by 1525, she'd been born in 1485, so she was 6 or 7 years older than Henry, and she was 40 years old, which is not really considered old now, but it was considered old. 40 was considered old when I was young, let alone in the 16th century. So she's really getting on a bit by 1525. Now, this is a family tree to try to explain the background to the Wars of the Roses, and it looks very complicated because it is very complicated. But you don't need to worry too much about this, because I'm just going to point out some salient facts. It was all Edward III. He had 12 children, as well as another 7, as well as these 5 across the top. And from him descended the Lancastrian line, here in red, and the Yorkists here in white. You know, the red rose was for the Lancastrians and the white rose for the Yorkists. you can see all the ones that have a black rim were killed in battle, executed, or mysteriously disappeared, like the princes in the towers down here. And you can see that Henry VIII, as I mentioned here, is descended through Henry VII, who came down through the illegitimate Beaufort line, and the second marriage of Henry V's widow. So he actually had no Lancastrian blood. Henry VIII, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, and Henry VIII was the result and became king after his brother died. So you can see just perhaps in the recording, you can look at this more carefully if you want to, but you can see how very complicated it was and why Henry then was so very desperate to have a male heir. A female heir, there was no precedent for, except for Matilda back in the 12th century, and that hadn't been very successful. So by this time, by the 1520s, with Catherine's childlessness and Anne's winning ways, Henry began to think again. He was haunted by a biblical reference from Leviticus 20:21, that if a man shall take his brother's wife, it's an unclean thing. He's uncovered his brother's nakedness and they should be childless. So the idea is that you shouldn't marry your brother's widow. And there was this big question of whether the marriage with Arthur had actually been consummated with Catherine of Aragon, who swore that she came as a virgin to Henry. But Henry didn't take much notice of in Deuteronomy, where it says that a man actually should marry and look after his brother's widow. So it was all very complex. And at that time, the succession of the dynasty rested with one small, very small girl, Mary Tudor. So Henry started to look around rather. And I thought I'd just sort of set this up as if it was an internet dating website, that handsome Henry with his picture here, looking at his age, he's broad and sturdy, he's very handsome, speaks French, some Latin, home tutored, occupation king, annual income either millions or bankrupt. He was a glutton with a drink problem. He didn't smoke, but it wasn't invented. And he was divorced. He had a vacancy for a mistress, and long-term was considered. And his hobbies were banqueting, invading France, and jousting, and so on. And he was in serious need of a son, and he was looking for a partner because he was attractive and rich and king, not because he was a sexual predator, of course, and confident of obtaining a divorce. So he would like to meet an educated, intelligent, attractive female with a view to producing an heir who must be fertile, not prone to revolution and revolutionary ideas. And so his ideal match. Anyway, I'm sure you've all had a look at that, and I just included that for fun. We look back at Anne Boleyn and at her character and appearance, and I said, again, we don't know a lot about her physical appearance, but there are some contemporary descriptions. The Venetian envoy described her as not one of the handsomest women in the world, middling stature, a swarthy complexion. She might have been sort of slightly tanned after so many years further south in France. She had a long neck and a wide mouth, but her eyes were particularly black and beautiful. She was stylish and cultivated. These are her skills. She was kind of applying for the job of consort. She was adept at courtly love. She had lots of energy, vitality. She was always the centre of attention. And she wore the latest fashions from France. She wore this type of French hood instead of that sort of gabled affair that Catherine of Aragon tended to wear. But there are later portraits and descriptions, and some describe her as evil with physical deformities, but they're mostly later, and they're often by enemies like Nicholas Sander, who was very pro-Mary Tudor. in league with Mary Tudor, who said she had a large wen or growth under her throat and 6 fingers on her right hand, which could have been a sign of a witch, but actually it's not that uncommon. And there's actually a celebrity nowadays who had that. Even George Wyatt, the son of that poet who was interested in her, observed that on the side of her nail there was a little show of a nail, but these were taken by many as the sign that she was evil or nasty, although actually witchcraft was never formally laid against her. But I think that if she hadn't been attractive, then it's very unlikely that Henry would have been attracted to her. The one contemporary portrait is this medallion. And you can see that there's been an attempt to destroy it by smashing it here and crushing the face as part of this idea of trying to obliterate memory of her. But an artist's impression on the left, the most happy in 1534, the year after she was married, the year after Elizabeth was born. She was at her peak at this time, and we could get an idea of what she might have looked like. So their courtship, Anne and Henry's courtship, was between 1525 to 27, and they met at a courtly entertainment at York Place, a palace in central London, where the young men were making an assault on a mocked-up castle full of maidens, of which Anne was one. By 1525, Henry was expressing jealousy when she gave some tokens to other courtiers, and so he offered to make her his sole mistress and wrote to her, "If it shall please you to do me the office of a true loyal mistress," he says, "I promise you that I will take you for my only mistress," which is a bit kind of churlish. And then he goes on to explain that by absence we are kept at a distance, but love retains its fervour on my side, and he hoped she loved him too. And then he's really falling for her. These letters, there are 17 of Henry's letters survive, where he talks about the pain of her absence, and it was almost intolerable, except for the hope he had. So he's really genuinely, I think, fallen in love with her. And these letters, they ended up in the Vatican because they were probably taken as evidence by a sympathizer of Catherine of Aragon. But the letters do show Anne's gradual acceptance and Henry's obsession with her. Would you in my arms or I in yours? It's long since I kissed you. But she was not his mistress. He says that my heart will be devoted to you, greatly wanting that my body also could be. So I think we have in Henry's own words that she did actually kind of fend him off for many years, wanting to get the ring on her finger so that any child of hers with Henry would be legitimate. He was deeply in love with her, and gradually, as Cavendish, a contemporary, noted, the long-hid secret love between the king and Anne Boleyn began to break out. And he wrote, Henry, Anne Boleyn, Haute ne cherche, he's not looking for another. And that you can see at the bottom here, where he writes, Henry is not looking for another. And he puts her initials in a heart shape here, rather like a kind of lovesick schoolboy. So he's really obsessed with her, and this turned into what's known as the King's Great Matter. He wanted to be free to marry, or was it free to marry Anne? The whole idea of a son and a male heir, as I showed from the dynastic background, was really shaky. But this was also linked with a desire to be free from Rome and not to be ruled by the church in Rome, not to be ruled by Europe, a bit sort of like the first Brexit. And also his love for Anne, which, as I've shown through the letters, seems to be very genuine. And all these became inextricably linked. There's a local connection with St Albans, where I'm speaking from now. But they did have a lot of secret trysts all over the place, but there were quite a few legends about meeting in St Albans, staying at a Sopwell nunnery here, meeting in secret in the cedar tree under the churchyard. They might even have got married here. There were some mysteries connected with their marriage, which I'll talk about later. And of course, daughter Elizabeth, to become Elizabeth I, lived at nearby Hatfield House for a long time. So gradually, Anne Boleyn had public appearances, banquets, dancing, royal progresses, and she was living openly in the same palace as Henry was living with Catherine of Aragon. He proposed to her by letter in 1527, and she replied by sending him a jewel of a maiden on a storm-tossed ship, indicating her predicament. We don't know if she wrote as well, any letter might have been destroyed, but with this jewel survives. And so it seems that she was indeed waiting, hoping for the ring on her finger. So the divorce or annulment, and bear in mind the difference between a divorce where the marriage is is dissolved, or an annulment where it's maintained that the marriage was annulled and it was never valid in the first place. There's a bit of a difference here. So in 1527, at Henry's instructions, Wolsey began the formal proceedings. Catherine, as shown in this 19th century image here, refused to cooperate. Her Clement VII was the prisoner of Charles V, and Charles V was actually Catherine of Aragon's nephew. He was the Habsburg king of Spain and also Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. And so Clement VII was not going to cooperate either. In 1528, the request was repeated, and at this stage, it was fairly optimistic that it would happen quite quickly. But then in 1528, Anne fell very seriously ill with spreading sickness. She was transported back to Hever Castle, where Henry had visited her while they were courting. But she stayed there in 1528, and Henry didn't see her. He was terrified of getting this terrible illness and dying himself. But happily, she recovered. And then in 1529, the procedures for the divorce were accelerated, and a legatine court was set up at Blackfriars with Campeggio, who had come from Italy to do this. And Catherine avowed that she was his true and faithful wife, and she just stormed out of the court. But by this time, the king, as observed by Mendoza, the ambassador, the king was so blind with passion that there was nothing he would not do or promise to obtain his object. He caressed her openly and in public as if she were his wife. It's a bit like, there were 3 people in this marriage. And in 1529, Catherine still insisted, though, that she was Henry's true and faithful wife. In 1530, she was banished to Kimbolton Castle in the Fens. I don't know if you know about the Fens. They're sort of in the Norfolk part of England. And they're just very damp and boggy, and lots of rivers and lakes and marshes, and very, very unhealthy, very damp and dark. And so she was banished there. So it was a bit really like sending her off to a nunnery, and she never saw Henry again. And the process to get a divorce or an annulment continued. So these are the Henry, Catherine in the middle, and Anne Boleyn on the right, the 3 people, as it were, in this marriage. Now, at the same time, we need to think about the Reformation, because this is really also bound up with the situation of Anne Boleyn and her relationship with Henry. The Reformation had been gaining impetus since Martin Luther nailed his 95 thesis to the door of the church in Wittenberg in 1517. And by the 1520s, this had reached England. In 1525, Tyndale had issued his translation of the New Testament. And in 1528, he published The Obedience of a Christian Man, which argued the king, not the Pope, was the head of the church in England. And we know that Anne Boleyn had drawn these two publications by Tyndale to Henry's attention, who rather liked the idea of the king being the head and not the Pope. Also in 1528, Simon Fish wrote a supplication for beggars, arguing that the beggars, people were suffering and starving because all the money was going to the church, which owned a huge proportion of the wealth and property in England at the time. And anti-clericalism, of course, had been continuing since Chaucer. You might remember from school that Chaucer's clerics were ridiculed slightly, except for the faithful priest. And there was a lot of anti-clericalism, the Lollards and so on. But they wanted to reduce the power of the Pope and so on, and not have so much power with Rome. But this was really moderate anti-clericalism. There was not a concept of a Reformation and a breakaway. And Anne was very involved with these new ideas. And they eventually, of course, brought massive changes for England, especially the dissolution of the monasteries, to a system that had been in place for over 1,000 years. Now, the break with Rome in the early 1530s, Henry consulted academics and lawyers who supported him, and they dragged up the law of Praemunire in 1392, which stated that the king must be absolute in his own realm. And so there was a series of acts here, which I won't go into in detail, but it just shows how very complex it was to extricate England from the Catholic Church ruled from Rome. Again, a bit like the complications of Brexit and so on. Henry was to be supreme head, so long as the law of Christ allows. It was written in 1531. But then this clause was removed a year later in 1532. So he was to be supreme head, 1532. The Act of Annate stopped payments to Rome. The submission of clergy in 1532 made the clergy obedient to the king rather than the Pope. And Cranmer became Archbishop of Canterbury instead of Warham, and Wolsey had gone from the scene as well. So by the early 1530s, Anne adopted the motto, "Ainsi sera grogne qui grogne," meaning thus it is, and complain who will. She was going to get him, as it were. In 1532, she was made Lady Marquess of Pembroke, a noble title in her own right, and taken off for a meeting with Francis I, King of France, at Calais. She accompanied Henry. Now, the marriage, as I mentioned before, was a bit mysterious. The king, there's evidence that the king, after his return, married her on the 14th of November, 1532. This might have been in St. Albans. It might have been in Dover. And we know that she was pregnant in December 1532 because Elizabeth I was married in September 1533. There was an official ceremony. Cranmer officiated and recorded it in January 1533. And they were appearing together. The marriage to Catherine was declared null and void. And her coronation at Westminster in June 1533 was a massive ceremony. She was noticeably pregnant by then, but the crowds were not very keen on her. But although she was actually crowned with Edward the Confessor's crown, which was normally reserved for a ruling monarch. So she was actually crowned as a monarch, not simply as Henry's consort. She was, as I said, the most happy at this time. Elizabeth was born. That was a disappointment, perhaps, that she was a girl, but it was proof that she was fertile. There were lots of spending sprees, clothes, jewels, palace refurbishments, and her initials, A and H, Anne and Henry, their initials were intertwined and used as motifs all over the place. Lots of music, dancing, and courtly life. And then in 1534, she was pregnant again, so things seemed to be going quite well. The disentanglement with Rome was finalized by appeals. Nobody could appeal to Rome, especially Catherine of Aragon. It was not allowed. And the Act of Annates paying dues, more dues to Rome, and the Act of Succession recognizing Henry's children with Anne as heirs, Elizabeth as heir. And this was made treason, not to agree with this, and the Act of Supremacy making Henry supreme head. And of course, this resulted in the eventual executions of More and Sir Thomas More and Bishop Fisher. So Anne was involved in this, the Reformation, and it was really inextricably linked with the rejection of Catherine of Aragon, the wish for an heir. But Anne did have power and influence on Henry, and the Reformation was seen as helping the route to Henry's remarriage. I think it's an exaggeration to say that there would have been no Reformation without Anne, but she definitely played a significant role. England was inclined to reform anyway, as I mentioned, worldliness, the power and wealth of the church, Chaucer and the Lollards. And Anne was highly educated and intelligent. She thought for herself and had her own ideas about the new learning, the Protestant justification by faith. But all these actually contributed to her downfall. Anne also had a mixed relationship with Cromwell, who by 1532 was running the country. He clashed with Anne. They had stages of being very friendly and helpful for each other, but he clashed with her in particular over the dissolution of the monasteries. The monasteries had been traditional places where education was provided, the poor were helped, the sick were helped, and actually travellers were helped. And that applies to the monastery, the large monastery that used to be in St Albans. Now there's a cathedral near where I live. Other reasons he clashed with Anne were because he was always in favour of an imperial alliance with the emperor, whereas Anne, because of her upbringing, was pro-French. And he disliked Anne meddling in politics and eventually determined to bring about her downfall. So how and why did it all go wrong? I think the qualities desirable in a mistress, flirtatious, independent, thinking, were not good in a wife. Also, marrying the mistress creates a vacancy. Anne was highly educated and cultivated, and she had interest in politics and religion. She had a brain, which was important. But then this seemed to be leading to her being rather a meddling sort of person. And there still wasn't a son, years of waiting. If you look at the psychology behind this, years of waiting heightens expectations. And Henry had actually suffered many miscarriages. Catherine of Aragon and Anne between them had a very large number of miscarriages between them. Anne also started rebuking Henry for flirting while she was pregnant, and he took a new mistress. Although I think his mistresses were more likely to have been he might probably found when his wives were pregnant or away or something, he probably found satisfaction with, kitchen maids and things like that, so that he may or may not have had other illegitimate children, but he didn't want to complicate the succession by having other children with other noble women. So I think his feelings of disappointment and rage, disappointment led to blame, resentment, and rage. When you wait a long time for something, and he waited a long time for Anne and expected that everything would be all right, and then when it wasn't, this led to to blame and resentment and rage. I do think it must be so that Anne did sort of, they didn't sleep together until this marriage in late 1532, because Henry was a big bloke. If he wanted to take her, he would have taken her. So in fact, it was probably a mutual decision that they would hold off and in order to ensure legitimacy of any heir, otherwise the whole thing was pointless. So by 1535, when he'd been married to Anne for around 3 years, Henry changes from a dashing, power-hungry womanizer into a brute. There are some arguments that accidents in jousting also caused him to have injuries, and in particular head injuries, which might have accelerated this change in personality. And he was by now nearly 45, rethinking his situation, discontented with Anne herself. But there is still a lot of evidence that they had a good relationship in 1535. They went on a major summer progress all through summer 1535 around the country. There's evidence that he was defensive of Anne when she was criticised or became the butt of jokes. And they were actually looking at an imperial marriage alliance for Elizabeth, showing that she was that Henry recognised her. And in 1536, Anne was pregnant yet again. But what changed most things was the death of Catherine of Aragon in January 1536. Anne was more secure, perhaps after Catherine died, because you couldn't really have two queens. So she could perhaps, if once Catherine was gone, she would be more likely to be recognised as queen. Her legitimacy of her child or future children would be recognised. So she rather celebrated when Catherine died. But on the other hand, Henry could then repudiate his second marriage. It would have been very difficult for Henry to get rid of Anne Boleyn while Catherine of Aragon was still alive, because if he'd got rid of her, he might have been made to return to Catherine. So anyway, on the 7th of January, Henry and Anne celebrated. On the 24th, though, soon after Catherine's death, Henry was in a very serious jousting accident. He was unconscious for hours. They thought he was going to die. And as a result of that scare, Anne miscarried. But still, a lot of people say, well, this miscarriage of hers in January 1536 was the final straw. But I don't think so. I don't think the relationship was yet doomed. Just to digress for a moment with all these miscarriages, does the finger point at Henry? Did he really marry 6 infertile women? There were 10 failed pregnancies, 7 with Catherine and 3 with Anne in his first 2 marriages. And it's been argued recently that male infertility can be caused by diet and so on, and can result in miscarriage from women. Poor diet, sort of, although Henry was king, he would have existed on bread and meat, basically, like a modern day takeout burger diet, which is causing infertility nowadays. High impact exercise. And he actually had a BMI of 51.9, 54-inch waist, and he weighed 28 stone. This is enormous. And so I think this, you know, the idea of blaming women for all the miscarriages, which Henry obviously did, blaming Catherine and then Anne, I think new research is looking at men's roles in this. So anyway, there was, by spring 1536, as I said, although Anne had miscarried in the January, Henry and Anne were at Greenwich Palace. There were Easter and May Day celebrations, and a trip to Calais was planned. He was still giving gifts of clothes, jewellery, books and property, and land to Anne, her father and her brother. Anne's priest, Skip, gave a sermon against an evil counsellor, which was obviously Thomas Cromwell, but he got away with it. And on the 18th of April, Henry publicly endorsed Anne as queen. The imperial ambassador Chapuis acknowledged her at the Easter. And at the end of April, 25th of April, the dates are quite important here. So on the 25th of April, Henry wrote to the English ambassador in Italy, talking about the likelihood that God would send them heirs male. And he referred to our dear and most beloved wife. But about the same time, Cromwell organised a patent to investigate her. So even as late as the 25th of April, he did refer to her as his dear wife. Now, Cromwell saw Anne as a threat, and adultery was regarded as treasonous because you wouldn't know who the father of the child was. The legitimacy would be queried, and so on. And also plotting the death of the king, or even talking about the death of the king, was significant. So it wasn't simply due to the miscarriage or Jane Seymour. Cromwell had proof that Anne was unfaithful and she had made a fool of him, and she had to go. So what happened? Everything happened in the weekend of the 29th and 30th of April, 1536. And Henry suddenly turned fiercely against Anne. I think this seems to me, what it occurred to me was a little bit like Othello and Iago. I see Cromwell as a Iago figure. Henry was a big blustering military man, a bit like Othello, and Iago, like Cromwell, was a bit sneaky. And I think he probably whispered in Henry's ear whether Anne had been unfaithful, and he had the evidence. So I think that something happened that weekend, and the question of whether Henry was instructing Cromwell or whether it was Cromwell who really sparked everything, I think will always be questioned. So on Saturday the 29th, Mark Smeaton, the musician, was overheard speaking about his sort of calf-like devotion to Anne Boleyn. And on Sunday, the 30th of April, Anne had been overheard again joking about marriage to Sir Henry Norris. She said, if Henry died, perhaps he'd like to marry her. And Norris was horrified because even mentioning the king's death was treasonable. And Anne rushed off to Henry and declared her love for him. Hopefully to stave off any criticism. But on the evening of 30th of April, Mark Smeaton was arrested and interrogated, possibly tortured, or possibly he confessed in the hope that he would be let off. And then also on the 30th of April, very abruptly, late at night, the trip to Calais was cancelled, but the tournament for the 1st of May went ahead. Had Cromwell persuaded Henry of Anne's guilt? Anne attended the May Day entertainment, and she threw a handkerchief to Norris. You might recall that Desdemona threw a handkerchief to Cassio. So I think Shakespeare's Othello is probably written for Elizabeth I about her parents, but that's just an idea of mine. Again, my confidence in this idea is not evidence. Henry left abruptly. He rode back to York Place with Norris, and he never saw Anne again. Smeaton, again, possibly under torture, incriminated others. Anne's brother, George, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton. They were all sent to the Tower. There were actually 3 others. It was actually 8 people to start with. Page, Wyatt and Bryant were also accused, but they were let off quite quickly. So there were 5 men who were sent to the Tower. And then on the 2nd of May, the day after the tournament, Anne was arrested. Now, when she reached the Tower of London, she was shown to some nice apartments rather than a dungeon. And she said, "Oh, it's too good for me." She was really relieved and pleased. But this, "it is too good for me," was later seen as a confession of guilt. While she was in the Tower, Master Kingston, who was in charge of the Tower, the warden of the tower, said that she babbled continuously, she wept and she laughed hysterically. She asked him, "Shall I die without justice? The poorest subject has justice." And she laughed hysterically. And here's a Victorian image of what her life in the tower would have been like. And holding Elizabeth there. Elizabeth was with her some of this time. So on the 12th of May, the trials of Smeaton, Norris, Weston and Brereton took place in a scenario rather like this. The jury was packed with people who supported Henry and obviously would be in favour of the prosecution of Anne. The dates of the liaisons that she'd had were impossible. Many of them it was clear that she had been elsewhere when these liaisons were supposed to have taken place. Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, said they were all condemned by presumptions. They all maintained their innocence and refused to admit adultery or treason, except for Smeaton, and they were all found guilty and sentenced to death. The trials of Anne and George Boleyn took place later because they were nobility. And again, here's another Victorian image of Anne in the Tower. And they were tried by a noble, a different sort of panel of judges, which included the Duke of Norfolk, who was actually Anne's mother's brother, her uncle. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was included, and Henry Percy, who'd been one of her suitors, was included. She was very harshly interrogated, accused of adultery, incest, treason, plotting the king's death, but not witchcraft. And there was no transcript of the trial. There was no legal defender, as was customary. It was all based on Smeaton's confession, court gossip, the libertine reputations of the men, her own comments, which seemed to sort of put her in peril. And one witness was Jane Rochford, who was George Boleyn's estranged wife, who hated him. And also because the men had already been found guilty. If they were accused of adultery and found guilty of adultery with her, then obviously she was de facto guilty as well. So she maintained she'd ever been a faithful wife. She swore on the sacrament that she was innocent just before the day before her execution. She affirmed on the damnation of her soul that she had never offended with her body against the king. So this was really, you know, that would have mattered hugely to her. She swore on the sacrament that she was innocent. And observers, Wriothesley, for example, said she made so wise answers to everything that it seemed clearly that she was innocent. Even Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, talk about how much courage she showed and how she seemed ready to meet death. And Cranmer, the archbishop, said he'd never had better opinion in a woman, which made him think she couldn't be culpable. But then he said, well, she must be, otherwise Henry wouldn't have blamed her. And here again is an image. This is actually a Dutch, the inscription in Dutch shows how widely her story was known. So the marriage was actually annulled on the 16th of May. Perhaps she agreed to she didn't want an annulment to start with because it would have illegitimized Elizabeth, but perhaps it was annulled in the hope that she would have a last minute reprieve or even perhaps an easier death. And she laughed hysterically quite a lot at this time, saying she had a little neck, but she seemed to be very resigned to death. She was found guilty to be burned or beheaded, and as a friendly gesture, Henry arranged an expert swordsman to come from France to execute her swiftly. Her last speech from the scaffolding Who Christian people, I've come to die, and by the law I'm judged to die, so I won't speak against the law. She wasn't confessing. She was saying, well, the law had found her guilty, and she'd really given up the will to live by then, I think. And she prayed God for the king, and, you know, that he was a good and gentle sovereign. I think this was really for Elizabeth's sake. And she took her leave. So, just finishing off now, was she guilty? Her trial was probably fair by the standards of the day, and the fact that it was hasty and unfair by our standards does not mean that she was innocent. After her efforts to become queen, would she really risk everything to risk her status by having an affair? One possible reason for affairs might have been to get pregnant, but I also think this is unlikely. I don't know what you think. Or perhaps it was to retaliate against Henry's affairs, or perhaps she just disliked him. And why would she conspire to kill him? Because if he had been killed, she would probably have been expelled, and Mary might well have become queen, not Elizabeth, with Anne Boleyn herself as a regent. She seemed to be doomed anyway, because Cromwell was determined to get rid of her. She had sworn her innocence on the sacrament. And by the 30th of May, Henry had married Jane Seymour, pictured on the left. But it wasn't simply a question that Henry had got tired of her and married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, by the way, came from the noble Seymour family, who were absolutely famous for their fertility. She had loads of siblings. Her parents both had loads of siblings, so that was a reason for marrying Jane Seymour. But Elizabeth eventually became queen, and also as a postscript, all Anne's opponents died rather painfully or were executed. Henry died painfully of gout and ulcers. He lasted till 1547. Cromwell was executed. Cranmer was executed by Mary Tudor. Jane Rochford was executed. Henry Percy and Thomas Boleyn died of illness very shortly after the trial. So was she guilty, or just flirtatious and indiscreet? She was arrested, tried, condemned, and executed within 17 days. So I think here, you know, Henry's saying, you know, it had taken him 7 years to get rid of Catherine of Aragon. So I think chopping her head off was a quicker solution when time was running out for Henry. Anne's legacy is more important than her gruesome death. And it altered the course of history because Henry fell in love. Her legacy on influence on Henry's religious, political and economic policies, on the Reformation, and of course on Elizabeth, that she was fiercely protective of her rights, and she arranged for her to be educated and looked after by theologians and academics. And of course the loss of her mother probably had a very profound psychological effect on Elizabeth, since her father had executed her mother. Elizabeth wore a ring here, pictured here, with an image of Elizabeth herself and her mother in the ring. It folds over at the top. It's kept at Chequers, and that's evidence of her, Elizabeth's devotion to the memory of her mother. And there was also a woven tablecloth made with the Elizabeth sign of the Anne Boleyn's sign of the falcon, crowned falcon, was woven by Thomas Gresham in 1571, showing how well this was known, that Anne Boleyn's symbol, and that Elizabeth was so devoted to the memory of her mother. And just recently, it's been in the news in the last month, that a wooden sign of the falcon has been rediscovered recently and is claimed as Anne Boleyn's. And of course, there are all these films and movies. You can see here all the different actresses who have played Anne Boleyn. Helen Bonham Carter, Geneviève Bujold, Natalie Porter, Natalie Portman, Vanessa Redgrave. There's a musical in London, and even a black Anne Boleyn was recently featured in a BBC drama. So, do we love her or hate her? The Protestants emphasised her virtues, the Catholics her wickedness. She's been seen as the proto-feminist heroine, educated, unconventional, outspoken, ambitious. And but these qualities were the ones that eventually led to her downfall. But who could not feel sorry for someone who had their head cut off? Harlot or heroine, whore or saint, a nasty piece of work or an innocent victim? We'll never know for sure. And perhaps, I don't know, for those of you there in the hall, perhaps we could have a show of hands again. Do people still wonder whether she's a harlot or a heroine? Or I'd be interested to know if anybody's mind has been changed by this talk I've given. So I'd be interested if you've got time for a few questions and discussion. I'm sorry I've overrun by about 5 minutes, but let's see, if there are any questions that anyone has to ask. And these are, I wrote a booklet. It's a very slim thing. It's available on Amazon, and I recently also did a paper on Henry VIII and infertility. So there we are, and I thank you very much, everybody, for listening to me.
Thank you. You'll be interested to know, I think many people who, when you ask them to vote the first time, have voted differently afterwards.
Right. How's the voting gone?
Yeah, no, I think you've won over most of them. I'm glad you mentioned the discovery of that wooden falcon, because I was going to ask you about it. Yeah, because it was I got the WhatsApp message about it last week. The owner's going to put it on display somewhere. I think, is it going back to Hampton Court?
I think it's going to Hampton Court. Yes, it was quite big news here recently because it's of the link with Anne Boleyn. It had been known about. But this falcon symbol, I think, is really important for knowing how she was valid. Although Henry VIII tried to obliterate her, it clearly had a very significant effect on Elizabeth I. Yeah. And all her followers. And the idea that some of these things and her missal and the letters and so on were kept secretly by her supporters, in spite of all Henry VIII's efforts to curb her memory.
And an interesting point about the scriptural references, he of course used the Deuteronomy one to be allowed to marry Catherine in the first place.
Yes, yes.
And then when he tried to get rid of her, he used the Leviticus one. So he picked and chose which.
And he wasn't, the marriage with Catherine wasn't actually annulled until after he'd married Anne. So all this thing about Leviticus, and yet he didn't seem very bothered about adultery or bigamy. He sort of picked and chose what suited him, really.
That's right. Yeah, because the church originally wouldn't allow him to marry Catherine, so that's when the Deuteronomy text was used by him.
Yes, because he got a dispensation from Pope Julius to do that. He was a bit sort of very insecure. In spite of all the sort of the big bluster and everything, I think he was very insecure, really genuinely was worried, why can't I have a son like everybody else? And I think, there are questions about fertility all round. The families of Catherine and of Aragon and Anne Boleyn had quite good records, Henry's family.
Well, and poor Jane Seymour died, of course, so
yes,
she couldn't go on to produce many.
No, and he was quite old by then. He was 45, which was really getting on, and she'd have had several sons by then. It was a tragedy, and he was a bit paranoid. Why is this? And it's because God had something, out for him, and wouldn't permit it. Sort of.
What kind of a relationship was there between Anne and Mary Tudor?
Mary did not get on with Anne because, of course, she continued to recognise her mother as queen, and Anne actually was behind Henry forbidding Mary to go and see and stay with Catherine. She didn't get on at all well with Mary, who Mary had been born in 1516. So depending on which date you take as Anne's date of birth, she wasn't a great deal younger than Anne. Probably that would have been between 10 to 15 years younger, which is not a huge amount.
Could she have had any role in the demise of Anne?
Mary Tudor, I suppose it's possible. I think Henry had seen her from time to time, and as she grew, he might have thought of her as a reasonable heir. That's very good. That's a very good question, Hurt, like your questions always are. I doubt if she would, though, because of course Mary, like her mother, was a very staunch Catholic, and she would have immensely disapproved of everything. And she, for that reason, I think everything went through Cromwell. She would not have had an access to Henry through Cromwell or any influence through Cromwell. I think she was kept at court. She was rendered illegitimate and so on. Very good, very interesting idea. Yeah.
Valerie, do you think Hilary Mantel's books have skewed attitudes to Anne? Because, I mean, you know, Cromwell really is the hero. Yes,
I have very mixed feelings about Hilary Mantel's books. I read the first one when it came out, and I thought this was a great idea to tell the tale from Cromwell's point of view. But I found that it was a lot that was very sensational, which I didn't really like. And she's kind of in love with Cromwell, let's face it.
Yes.
So I think it has skewed it slightly. And I think, to be honest, you know, Anne Boleyn, although, you know, maybe more of a heroine than a harlot, she was no angel. You know, she stood up for herself. I think this is why she's a sort of a feminist heroine, that she stood up for herself at a time when it really wasn't the thing to do, especially if you were married to King Henry. If he'd been, you know, knowing his character, you know, let alone being king, it wouldn't have worked. You know, Cromwell has, you know, got more attention because of Hilary Mantel's books, but personally I didn't like them a great deal, and I thought in the televised versions I didn't like the casting. That was my own view.
We've got someone who wants to ask you something.
In this age of genetics, has anybody tried to use those methods to sort out this mess?
Well, if you look at the paper I did on Henry's fertility, I did this jointly with a doctor from Imperial College London. I saw a tiny newspaper article about how male genetic, it's called DNA fragmentation, can cause infertility in men. And this type of infertility can actually cause miscarriage in women. And I saw a tiny sort of 100-word article in a newspaper about this. And I thought, oh, that sounds like Henry VIII. So I contacted this doctor at Imperial. And during lockdown, I've never met him. We did it all over the phone and Zoom and exchanging things. We published a paper on the genetics of Henry VIII and, you know, linked to fertility. But I don't know if you're talking about other genetics, things like whether he fathered Mary Boleyn's children, or whether, you know, the links to the sort of subsequent royal family. But of course, the Tudor line died out with Elizabeth I, and the Stuarts then came in. James I, the 6th of Scotland, was descended from one of Henry VIII's sisters. So there is still some Tudor blood there, but I think genetically, it'd be worth looking at.
Valerie, I think we're going to bring this meeting to an end. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. If Anne Boleyn can be thanked for one thing, it is that she produced Elizabeth, who I agree is the greatest thing ever. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.